Now pay attention, boy. You see the shape of this crystal? That is a prism. The light is stripped by that angle, that refracts the ray, splits the colors, diffuses them at an oblique angle, and bends it out into a dispersed color band. You understand?
What he means is, the sun comes through here and paints a rainbow, you see?
Hello class, we're going to continue our discussion of electromagnetic radiation, and in this lesson we will see what Pollyanna was interested in, refraction of light and the visible spectrum. In our previous video lectures we talked about how energy can move as electromagnetic radiation, a wave that can move even in the absence of a medium, that even in the absence of a solid, liquid, or gas to travel through. Electromagnetic radiation moves at the speed of light, a very, very large number, 3 times 10 to the 8th meters per second, the maximum speed that anything can achieve. In the last lecture, we talked about a few properties of electromagnetic radiation. We talked about interference, we talked about the Doppler effect, and we talked about the polarization of light. This video lecture will cover some additional properties of light, including refraction and the visible spectrum of light. This slide seems to contain a lot of information, but I assure you that you're familiar with a lot of the concepts. This is about how light interacts with surfaces or with matter. First of all, light can be transmitted, like through air or through glass. Light can be transmitted through a substance. Light can also be reflected, such as reflection on a mirror or reflection on some surface. We'll skip refraction and go to diffraction. Diffraction refers to how light, when it passes through a very small pinhole or slit, can essentially be fuzzed out as it passes through this small hole or slit. Absorption. Absorption is basically the opposite of transmission. Whereas transmission, light goes through a surface or material. In absorption, it stops. It is absorbed by that material. Usually that means that it's absorbed as heat. Light can be scattered by small particles, which usually gives something the appearance of being cloudy. But let's go to refraction. And you've seen this quite often. You ever take a glass of water and you place a straw in the glass of water and it looks like something has happened. It looks like the straw has bent. But actually it's not the straw that is bending, but light is bending. What's happening? It turns out that light can be bent when it travels from one media to another, such as air to water. Now, another example of this is if you see a coin in a fountain and you try to reach it and it's actually a slightly different place than where your eyes tell you it is. It's usually a little bit lower. Also, if you've ever gone spearfishing, you've probably been told that you have to poke at the fish a little bit lower than where your eyes tell you it is because of this diffraction of light. And let's go to this next slide to learn a little bit more about refraction of light. We said that light travels with a maximum velocity of 3 times 10 to the 8th meters per second in a vacuum. But when it travels through other media, such as air or glass, it's a little bit slower. And refraction results when light is traveling through air and then at an angle strikes an interface with another media, such as glass. And even though it's traveling very rapidly, it will have a hitch in its get-along when it reaches an interface. And it turns out that the wavelengths of light that are shortest, the shortest wavelengths, will be bent more so than the longer wavelengths of light. If the original beam of light is what we call white light, which means that it has all wavelengths, there will be a bending due to this refraction phenomena of the various wavelengths of light, spreading them out. And in this example, the glass is what we would call a prism, so that the electromagnetic radiation that exits a prism will be spread across what we call the spectrum of light, where the shortest wavelength of light, what we call blue, indigo, and violet components of electromagnetic radiation, the ones with the shortest wavelength and highest frequency, will be bent the most, and those components that have the longest wavelength and lowest frequency red and orange, will be bent the least, and those components of the electromagnetic spectrum that we call yellow and green will be in the middle. So a prism spreads out light, revealing the colors of light, the spectrum of light. This is what fascinated Pollyanna. Now, before leaving this slide, let me go back and talk about the phenomena of reflection and absorption. I'm wearing a dark blue shirt. Why does it appear dark blue to you? It appears dark blue because it's actually reflecting that region of the visible spectrum which we call blue. And it's absorbing, pigments in the cloth are absorbing the other regions of this visible region of the electromagnetic spectrum. That is, my shirt is absorbing the red, orange, yellow, and green regions of the spectrum. And likewise, if I were wearing a red shirt, my shirt would be reflecting the red part of the visible spectrum and absorbing the blue, green, and yellow part of the visible spectrum. That's why it would appear red to you. So the colors we see are what are reflected, which are a result of the other wavelengths being absorbed. Red, blue, red, blue. That's probably enough. This slide shows the complete electromagnetic spectrum. If we begin over to the right, we have what are called radio waves. This is the means by which FM and AM radio signals are sent from a transmitter to our radio receivers. The wavelengths of radio waves are as long as 100 meters long. Then we have microwaves, yes, our microwave oven. Then we have a region of the electromagnetic spectrum called the infrared. Then there's the visible region. It's sort of in the middle of this electromagnetic spectrum. Then we have ultraviolet, ultraviolet UV rays, X-rays, and gamma rays. This scale goes from the longest wavelengths, radio waves, to the shortest wavelengths, gamma rays. Each of these is a region or a part of the electromagnetic spectrum. It is all energy that can travel at the speed of light 3 times 10 to the 8th meters per second. Now, to give you some references, for radio waves, 100 meters, that means the wavelength is the length of a football field. Then we have, to give you some perspective, we have 1 meter. 1 meter is our size. That is, most of us are 1 to 2 meters tall, and maybe our girth is about a meter. Humans are in the 1 meter scale. Then we have a centimeter, which is our fingernail scale. And going over to like 0.01 centimeters, that's like the width of a human hair. And the reason I point out these is because notice that most of the region of the spectrum, including the visible region of the spectrum and ultraviolet, and X-ray, and gamma rays, are much shorter wavelengths. Very, very short wavelengths. Looking at the visible region, we see that it's between about 380 to 780, what we call nanometers, in its wavelength. I'd also like to talk to you about some topics in the area of photobiology. Photobiology refers to the study of the interaction of electromagnetic radiation with living systems. Probably the most important on planet Earth, the most important photobiological phenomena is photosynthesis, in which a molecule such as shown on the bottom left, chlorophyll, can absorb light and then initiate a set of biochemical reactions leading to the synthesis of glucose. Because without photosynthesis, we wouldn't be here. It turns out that there are 2 important types of chlorophyll, A and B. And the graph on the right shows what is called an action spectrum. It shows the wavelengths on the x-axis, where the chlorophylls absorb photons in the visible spectrum range, and this absorption of energy then initiates these biochemical reactions. Now, you'll notice that the chlorophylls, whether we're talking about A or B, absorb in the blue region and they absorb in the red region, but they reflect light in the green to yellow region. So is it surprising that plants appear greenish? Now, there are other secondary or accessory pigments in various plants, and that would be why different plants will have different colors. When we talked about sound waves, I said that we have this exquisite organ, an ear, which can respond to compression waves in air. Well, we have an equally exquisite, if not more exquisite, organ, the human eye, which responds to light. In an eye, there are two important kinds of cells, what are called rod cells and cone cells, which are the basis for sensing light. The rod cells are the more sensitive of the cells, and they detect very low light levels. But the cone cells are the basis for our ability to distinguish colors. Most humans have what we call trichromatic vision, and that's because we have three types of cone cells: blue cone cells, green cone cells, and red cone cells, which, yes, absorb light in the blue region of the visible spectrum, the green region of the visible spectrum, and the red region of the visible spectrum. Now, it turns out that insects and fish are tetrachromatic. They actually have another type of cone which absorbs further into the ultraviolet. And some humans are also tetrachromatic, and they have an additional type of cone. This characteristic of being tetrachromatic is usually seen in females because it's a sex-linked, that is X chromosome-linked trait. And you can also imagine that if most humans are trichromatic, that someone who is partially colorblind or fully colorblind may be deficient in one or more of these types of cone cells. Other topics in the area of photobiology. Phototropism, which refers to the ability of plants to grow towards a light source. Sunflowers will turn and face the sun. Circadian rhythm refers to various physiological or biochemical processes that seem to be related to the day-night cycle, so must in some way be related to either light or the absence of light. Bioluminescence, an example, we're talking about fireflies, of how some living systems can actually emit light. Ultraviolet damage, another important topic. Ultraviolet light can damage our cells and certain molecules in our cells, and especially DNA, and some of this can lead to mutations. And there are various biomedical applications of the use of X-rays and gamma radiation for diagnosis and treatments. So this is a very large field with a number of applications. Before finishing this video lesson, I thought I'd show you a depiction of the protein called rhodopsin. This is one of the proteins in rod cells that detects the photons that then leads to the image that our brain creates. Besides being a nice looking protein molecule, these 7 curlicue things, the key component is actually the white part in the middle, which is the molecule retinal. Retinal comes from vitamin A, also it may be called beta-carotene. And the key reaction for the ability to see, to detect photons, is that retinal ordinarily is bent in what is called cisretinal. When it absorbs the photon, it straightens out. And this straightening out to transretinal, it's like a knee-jerk reaction in straightening out your leg. It causes a conformational change in rhodopsin, which then is transduced to other protein molecules, which then gives rise to a nerve impulse, which eventually will lead to our brain being able to synthesize this image. Okay, let's go back to our very first slide, where we started, fiat lux. Have you figured out what fiat lux stands for? I show the Hebrew and the Latin versions of this phrase. This phrase is, let there be light. Fiat lux, let there be light. And it was good. Okay, we're going to pause for a quiz. We've covered waves and light, but we'll be talking about light and photons in other contexts in this course. We'll talk about the theory of relativity. We'll talk about the relationship of the speed of light in time and space. We'll also talk about quantum mechanics and how when things are very, very small and move very, very fast, we have to have a complete new construct in order to try to understand phenomena. And along the way, we'll talk about such interesting characters as Schrodinger's cat and Maxwell's demon. So now that we have an introduction to waves and light, we'll be able to cover these other interesting topics. See you then.